as a base of operations in the war with the United States, Germany would capture and give to Mexico the territories that we had taken from Mexico. And apparently the Germans had read our history book and knew we had taken Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. The Germans promised Mexico that they would give those territories back. Folk, now I'll never know why, but the Mexican government refused. The Mexican government might have been smarter than I realized. Mexico might have felt like that Germany had no chance to win the war anyway. Keep in mind, during both world wars, Germany never did get a base of operations in the Western Hemisphere to fight the United States, whereas we had base of operations in Europe to fight Germany. They never did get a base of operations in the Western Hemisphere to fight us. Nevertheless, the Mexicans refused the offer. Well, they asked Ambassador Zimmerman, hey, did you really send that telegram? They expected Ambassador Zimmerman to deny it. For whatever reason, Ambassador, yeah, it's my telegram, I sent it. He actually admitted to it. Nevertheless, this turned the time, and the Washington Post published the article, and all the other newspapers in the country took it up. In other words, Germany is itching for war with the United States, or they're preparing for war. Well, like I say, this turned the tide. Finally, Wilson asked for a declaration of war. He gave a speech. Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress. When both houses of Congress meet in one room, they have to meet in the House. The Senate is just not big enough. So the senators came to the House, and Wilson stood in front of both House and Senate and asked for a declaration of war. He said, it's a fearful thing to lead this great and peaceful nation to war, but the right is more precious than the peace. Wilson feared, as your book will mention, he feared that the country would be divided. Yes?
It's funny when you talk about this history and just getting the backdrop of what was really going on.
Yeah.
It gives you a more in-depth insight of what you're saying. You're saying stuff along the lines of what my uncles used to say. And you don't know, and you don't have any newspapers to give you adequate information about it. You just think of
Well, also, when you're living through something, you get it piecemeal. Now, it's one thing for me to read through this history book and read about the events that I remember.
Right.
But I picked up on it piecemeal and did not associate this event with that the way the history books do.
Exactly.
Yeah. Again, if you lived through it, you'll notice, and I must say this, Woodrow Wilson's wife took really bad sick about the time that the war was breaking out in Europe. And he spent his time, he neglected his duty as president, even though we don't believe that he could have prevented the war in Europe, but he just didn't pay attention to the affairs of Europe while he stayed by his wife's bedside. Well, she died, and he quickly married a different woman. One of the few marriages conducted by a sitting president while in the White House. Grover Cleveland had one, and Woodrow Wilson had one. And yes, folk, I must mention this. I mean, this cannot be proven. It was a rumor going around at the time that Wilson had actually killed his first wife so he could marry a second one. So he had poisoned her to make her sick. This is an idle rumor that can't be proven and might not should be mentioned, but I mention it because it was the story going around at that time. Again, your book will say nothing about it, but if you do the research. Anyway, finally Wilson did pay attention to foreign affairs. He asked for a declaration of war. Now, it was really timely because about the time that we declared war on Germany and Austria, Russia pulled out of the war. This enabled the Germans to take all their troops who'd been fighting on the Russian front and put them against the French and British, which really was bad news for Britain and France. Had the United States not gotten in, folk, it is likely that Britain and France would have lost. As it was, the United States declared war in 1917. Pershing asked for 1 million men. He got 2 million. And Pershing was slow at committing the men at first. But then when Germany began to get desperate and made a big last-ditch offensive, Wilson finally committed because they got the French to run. The French troops running pell-mell, and when the French troops ran into the American troops on the second line, the French said to the Americans, we've lost, get out of here. And the American answered them, hey, no, we just got here. The Americans began to engage the Germans, and they stopped the German advance. it would not be fair to say that we won the war because the Germans were, I mean, well, actually, probably, I mean, okay, what I'm saying is the French and British and Russians had really done a lot of damage before the Americans got in. So the Americans were, the Americans were a big moral boost. Now, something else, folks. If you look at the picture of Wilson, the Big Four, I don't know if this book has a picture, the American was much bigger than his European counterpart. Bigger than the British. Now, this is not as true as it was. This was due not just to better diet on the part of the Americans, but it was due to the fact that the Americans married over the horizon, or married people they were less related to. In other words, typically an American Italian man might marry a French woman, and what this meant is that your offspring were bigger, stronger than what either of the parents were. And I'll say this too, yeah, I mean, if this sounds racist, why do professional football teams have more than 50% of their players black? Is because the black people's ancestry is more diverse than that of most Europeans. This is true of basketball also. Most of your professional basketball players are black, and again, it's because their black ancestry is more diverse. Now, if any of you want to comment on that, your comments are welcome. All right. And most of your boxing champs, black. But anyway, the American was bigger, and again, this is owing, I think, a lot to the fact that the Americans married over the horizon, married strangers. By a stranger, I mean someone neither your kith or kin had ever met. My dad married a stranger. I married a stranger. My dad was a Pennsylvanian, married a Kentucky girl. I was from the north and married a Florida girl. Complete, by a stranger, I mean none of my kith or kin had ever heard of her, and none of her kith or kin had ever heard of me.
But isn't that like almost a good thing though, almost?
I think, all right, it might not be good socially,
Okay.
but genetically, it's good for our genes.
It's funny you say that now. I was driving for because my wife is like, from the West Indies.
Yeah.
And when we married, it was almost to that point. It wasn't. It was accepted, but I'm always known as the Yankee when I go to Jamaica. I'm the Yankee.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of just I'm
Yeah.
embraced, but not completely because I'm not Jamaican, I guess.
I know what you mean. Yeah, you're not one of them.
Yeah, they let me know a lot of times.
But it's more acceptable than it would have been a generation or two ago.
Yeah.
All right, now, meantime, back at home, oh yeah, well, I'll get to this. Shortly after the United States got involved in serious fighting, the war ended. Back at home, Woodrow Wilson was strongly against giving women the right to vote until up to the time of the election of 1916, and he realized he had better change his mind if he hoped to be reelected. He won a really, the closest election in history, I believe, except for the closest election up to that time. He barely won. About 4,000 votes in one precinct, or in one area, would have thrown the election to Charles Evans Hughes. But Wilson changed his mind and pushed for giving women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment was ratified, and the first election where women voted was the 1920 presidential election. Number one, remember, is the 19th Amendment. 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. 19th Amendment. Now, trade with Germany was stopped. Germans were harassed, otherwise, some of them were lynched. And also there were pamphlets thrown around, don't tell anything to a German. Keep your mouth closed when you're around Germans. Be quiet, because it was known that a lot of Germans were spying and finding ways to secretly report what they saw to the German High Command. And again, I've already mentioned how the Germans seemed to have known that the Lusitania was carrying armaments. And again, the British government will not allow anyone to go down there and find out what the Lusitania actually was carrying. But Germans were harassed. Laws were passed against dissent. Eugene Debs was given a 10-year sentence, but I must say about Debs, the next president after Wilson, President Harding, commuted Debs' sentence. You know, basically turned Debs loose. The president has that power, has the power to do that. Now again, folks, here's where I disagree with the author of your book. Your author of your book makes it sound like this squelching of dissent was a bad thing. It's something that has to be done in time of war. And we'll talk about this, especially when we come to World War II, when you may have heard the United States rounded up all the Japanese and put them in camps. Didn't starve them to death, didn't shoot them to death, but put them in camps for the duration of the war. Folk, everybody today condemns it, but at the time it was done in 1942, nobody condemned it. Nobody. Everybody at the time agreed with it. The communists agreed with it. The liberals agreed with it. Earl Warren was in charge. He was the most liberal Chief Justice we ever had later. And the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. What I fear is today we don't know how to make a war. They knew how then, we don't. But, nevertheless, now, in 1918, there was an off-year election. The Republicans gained control of both the House and Senate. This was a blow to Wilson. All right, the war ended. The Germany...
After the Treaty of Paris was signed?
Well, actually, the Treaty of Paris, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. The Peace of Paris. It is also known as the Treaty of Versailles because they met in the Palace of Versailles, where and Versailles is in Paris. Versailles was the home built by Louis XIV, where the kings of France lived.
Yeah, it looked like back in the 1700s, I believe.
Yeah, Louis XIV built it in the 1600s. Well, actually, it was in the late 1600s, early 1700s, somewhere around that time, built the Palace of Versailles. It's called the Treaty of Paris. Woodrow Wilson did something no other president had done. He left the country to go across the Atlantic. Now, we had another president who went to Latin America once while he was in office, but Wilson went to France while he was still president. He thought, no, but he became the first president to do so. He went to France, and he made a couple mistakes. Number one, he should not have gone. There was plenty of trouble at home that he needed to deal with. But number two, he should have sent an ambassador. It's called delegating responsibility or delegating authority. Folk, a real leader delegates. What's the advantage to delegating? Well, supposing you tell your ambassador, here's what I want you to do. The ambassador does it, and everybody backfires in your face. The president goes, oh, now this was the ambassador. Now that's not really what I meant. He didn't do what I wanted. And then the president can replace the ambassador with another one. It might seem like it's a lie, but this is plain old politics. Whereas if the president himself is doing the negotiating and something goes sour, he can't replace himself. Well, the country replaced him with another president, true. But anyway, Wilson came across with 14 points. The people of Europe thought he was great. The other ambassadors who were sent there to negotiate thought he was naive. Woodrow Wilson was full of lofty idealism, you might say too heavenly minded to be of any earthly good. He wanted to, well, as of his 14 points, he wanted to give self-determination to all peoples who were on a losing side. Basically, he wanted Germany and Austria to get rid of their kings, which they did. The Kaiser went to Holland and spent the last years of his life running a small garden in Holland, Homan, basically a pauper. He called for an end to secret treaties, and he called for free trade, no tariffs, reduction of weapons of war, recognition of the rights of colonial peoples, none of which Europe was ready for. The Europeans said Germany started this war, which was not exactly true, and Germany must pay. Now, after World War II, we learned better. We went in and rebuilt Germany and rebuilt Italy and rebuilt Japan. Rebuilt the nations who had fought against us after we'd torn them apart. This is why, to this day, more than 70 years after the war ended, Germany, Italy, and Japan have not fought us again. But after World War I, the nations of Europe, not Wilson, went, we have to punish Germany. Now, point 14 called for a League of Nations. All right,
Excuse me, sir.
League of Nations, yes.
I don't think, you know, still to this day, I don't think they're fighting us in the battle, which the war that we're used to them fighting us. But I think, what you just said, they're fighting us in a different way. Like now, they're beating us in technology, in different ways, like there's education. So I think right now.
Well, because of the invention of the atomic bomb, warfare changed after World War II,
Right.
owing to the fact that everybody knew war was so deadly that we had to fight on other fronts. And your book will mention that,
Right.
yeah. And some of this went on at this time too. Now, the League of Nations was where supposedly all the nations of the world would gather together and discuss their differences and iron out their problems peacefully without going to war. All right, Wilson came home. Oh yeah, I told you he made two mistakes. Mistake number one was going as the ambassador himself, when he should have sent a delegate ambassador. Number two, he only carried Democrats with him to Europe. This was, he should have made it a bipartisan effort. We could understand, he was a Democrat. He should have carried maybe 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans, or 4 Democrats and 3 Republicans. He should have included both parties, and he should have carried a majority of Democrats. We couldn't fault him for that. But he didn't carry any Republicans at all. But guess what? He had turned against him the party who has just now had the majority in both the House and Senate. And he made it a partisan issue with the Republican Party completely against it. Now, folk, here's a catch-22. He came home expecting that he would get his program ratified, the Treaty of Versailles. The United States never ratified the Treaty of Versailles. Never signed it. The United States did not join a League of Nations. All right, here was the problem. Now, before being president, Wilson had a series of strokes. One book I've read said that these strokes made Wilson extremely, extremely stubborn and unmovable. Now, I'm going to insert something that I hope won't offend, but it was Wilson's religious upbringing. Wilson came from the same church my father came from. I don't want to call their name. But a lot of people who come to this church are the predestinationists. They believe that once you have made up your mind, you should never change it. You should never alter your views. You should, in other words, basically Wilson was unwilling to compromise anymore. He compromised a lot in Europe, where he had to. But once he knew the States, he thought, I don't have to compromise, I'm not going to. Well, here's where he failed. The Senate said, now, according to the Constitution, the Senate has to oversee the president in treaty making. If you have put a clause in this treaty that you've got in the Treaty of Versailles that lets us oversee what you as president does, we'll vote for it. Well, said, no, I'm going to be in absolute charge. This was his big mistake. Now, there were some people, the isolationists, who said, we're not going to accept it because we don't believe we're not going to get involved in any more foreign wars. We're not going to get involved in any more foreign incidents. We're going to remain at home like we have ever since the days of George Washington. So there were the hard isolationists who could not be convinced. But, okay, baseball season started a couple days ago. Every team is going to win 60 games, and every team is going to lose 60. It's what you can do with the other games, the other 42 games that count. Some of you know what I mean. Well, Wilson could not get the isolationist vote. And he had a lot of the votes already. If he would have compromised, he'd have gotten the votes from the people who said, let the Senate oversee you, or look over your shoulder while you're making these treaties, while you're doing your work. Now, folk, this is something I always insert right now, and you can take this for whatever you want to. First of all, a great plague hit the world. The influenza outbreak of 1918 carried off 40 million people of 700,000 Americans. The highest person that carried off was the King of Spain. Woodrow Wilson himself got the flu. It was a outbreak of flu. Some people think it was bird flu, some think it was swine flu. This same flu, we don't know what it was because the electron microscope had not been invented. We don't know if this flu has ever come back, if it was a swine anyway. But an influenza outbreak hit, and influenza is still a problem. All right, here's the point I want to make. What do I think really was at the bottom of the opposition to Woodrow Wilson's treaty? People in those days were interested in Bible prophecy. And end-time prophecy mentioned three things. A huge war at the time of the end, a huge plague at the time of the end, and guess what? The world has just seen a huge war, a huge plague, and then it mentions a treaty. Whoops, we got to stay out of this treaty. We'll get involved. It's a treaty that will bring on the Antichrist. Yeah, the Antichrist is mentioned. Yeah. Okay, anyway, I think this was a big factor in why that a lot of people would not vote for it. Yes.
No, to his point now, Woodrow, you gotta respect it because the fact that he's actually trying to follow some type of belief in something.
Yes, yes.
So I'm not saying that he was right. I'm just saying,
Yeah.
that may have influenced, like you said, it did influence his prior decision-making process because he come from a hard,
A father who would never bend, and once he'd spoken, he would never change his mind, never move.
I mean, not that it's right. Think about it.
He had, in my day, they called it an inferiority complex, which he tried to make up for by high achievement. Yes, he had all these issues. Again, unwillingness to compromise, that hurt him at this point. Wilson could not overcome the opposition. For about the second or third time in history, a president went out during a non-election year to campaign. Wilson went out to campaign hard, and he worked really hard, and his doctors began to warn him, Mr. Wilson, you better slow down your work. He didn't. He suffered a big, debilitating stroke, from which he never fully recovered. He was rushed back to the White House. The extent of his mental debilitation was kept super secret. The vice president, knowing the president was still alive, refused to act. So basically the country had no president, except you might say we did have one president. Wilson's wife took over. I don't know how many bills that she forged her husband's signature on to sign into law. I don't know how many bills she vetoed. But basically she took over and did a lot of his work. I don't know how many generals she ordered around or how much, but she did a lot of the work that the president was supposed to do while nobody in the country knew just how sick the president was. Well, a few people did, his wife did, and the doctors did, but they kept that a secret. Now, if the 25th Amendment later came, and under the 25th Amendment, Wilson would be declared incompetent by a team of doctors, and the vice president would take over. But that's today. But in those days, the country had no, and during the time the country had no president, it experienced an economic downturn, strikes, riots, turmoil, bombings, a big communist scare, and Wilson was sitting flat on his back. When he finally got up a little bit, he could only work an hour a day. To give you some idea what kind of control the wife had, Wilson finally decided to hold a cabinet meeting one day. So he got the cabinet. In the meantime, his wife had the door cracked open a little bit where she could hear everything that was going on. The meeting went okay for a little while. Then all of a sudden, her husband, Wilson, started talking incoherently. She rushed into the room and told all the cabinet, go home and keep your mouth shut about what you saw here. Rushed her husband out of the room, and nobody knows where they went, but she got him out. Essentially, the cabinet got the idea, hey, our president is not very well. All right. Now, in Massachusetts, some policemen went on strike. The governor of Massachusetts, a man named Coolidge, who later became president of the United States, called out the National Guard and said, policemen have no right to strike.
What was his whole name, Coolidge?
Coolidge was president, after Wilson was Harding and then Coolidge.
What was his first whole name?
Calvin. Yeah, Calvin. Calvin Coolidge was the governor who ended up, unions were very unpopular. There was a steel strike and it failed. Labor was set back 20 years. It wasn't until World War II that labor began to reassert itself again. Now here came something else, what they call the Red Scare. And this is what's going to bother us again several years later. The Bolsheviks had taken over Russia. And there were people who believed the Bolsheviks were going to take over the United States as they had taken over Russia. And they began to call everybody in around them communist. And anyone who had the least little bit of a liberal tint, whether he be socialist or communist or whatever, was suspect. A lot of people were jailed. A lot of people were threatened. There were bombs set off, mail bombs set off. And again, some of this might have gone on both sides. Out of this turmoil came the American Civil Liberties Union. They said that, hey, this country, we have to respect people's rights. So the ACLU was formed. The ACLU is still around today. And the ACLU made news in Georgia just yesterday, right this morning.
What is that scene?
Basically, the ACLU is protesting the new abortion bill that Georgia passed. So they're still around, but they got started as a result of the quelching of free speech that went on at this time. And all right. Now, government contracts ended once the war was over. Soldiers by the hundreds of thousands got out of the army, and they went home and found they had no jobs. My grandpa Cunningham was one of them. Went back to his old factory, and the factory said, we don't make what we made before. We've turned ourselves into a war plant, and your skills are not needed. Now, this was outlawed before World War II. If you're worked at a place and you go off and join the army, the place you worked at has to hire you back. It's now the law. But in those days, there was no such law. My grandfather wound up finding another job. A lot of blacks moved to the north to try to find work, particularly during the war. And they believed that in the north they would not find discrimination, but they found that there was discrimination in the north also. In some cases even more so than the South. In the South, blacks and whites often worshiped in the same churches. In the North, black churches and white churches, they were separated. Having grown up in the North, I remember the denomination I was part of had a separate church for blacks and whites. During our conventions, the blacks would come from their church to the conventions. And during our camp meetings, they'd come in, but otherwise they worshiped in a separate church from the whites. This was not as true in the South as it was in the North. Mexican refugees poured across the border of Hoke. This is nothing new. This has been going on for more than 100 years. Mexico was involved in a big civil war, 10-year-long civil war. Refugees, and a lot of American employers hired them because Mexicans were willing to work cheaper than American workers. Had a roof put on 2 years ago, and guess what? The man we contracted brought in a whole bunch of Mexicans. I had no objections to it. I mean, and they did a good job, right? But they were doing work that Americans generally won't do, and willing to work for less money. All right. Wilson woke up enough from his, you might say, his coma or whatever he was in, to believe that the 1920 election would vindicate him. In the 1920 election, the Republicans ran Harding and Coolidge. Let's see. Now, of the 4 men who ran, 3 of them got to be president. The Republicans ran Harding and Coolidge. The Democrats ran Cox and another Roosevelt. This was Franklin. Now, of these 4 men, this one, and this one became president. This one did not. Both of these men were not, Harding and Cox were not really important men. It's just that both parties tried to run with someone who was not controversial. But it was an overwhelming Republican victory. Roosevelt, everybody, aren't you Theodore Roosevelt? Oh no, Theodore Roosevelt's my 5th cousin. They were cousins. We're going to keep him in mind. We're going to be talking a lot about it, but when he ran for vice president in 1920, he was defeated badly. Now, oh yeah, I've forgotten to mention this, folk, but it's, you're going to, the Solid South. The Solid South was a name given to southern states after the Civil War. When they got back into the Union, they almost always voted Democrat.
It's called the Solid South.
It was called the Solid South. They always voted Democrat. In 1920 now, at least one southern state voted for Harding. Now that's ironic because today most of you southern states that once were Democrat are now largely Republican. But things changed with in 1964 with Goldwater. But anyway, the southern states have tended to vote. They voted Democrat solidly during the elections of 1868, 1872, 1876, 1880, 1884, and on up. 1920, one of the southern states voted for Harding. Again, that was because there was a strong anti-Wilson sentiment involved. Now, folk, bear with me a moment. I'm going to pause and call roll. And while I do so, I never put up the roll on my